Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 3 of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. I'm missing my kids today a whole lot. I hope you guys are all doing good. And I wish we were in school so that I can see you guys and give you hugs and hear all the funny, wonderful things you guys always say, because that's what I miss the most. We're going to find out what happens today in Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. So far, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle has done a pretty good job of straightening some kids up. I think I'm going to have her come visit our classroom when she comes back to school. When we go back to school. All right. The answer backer cure. How many of your parents need help with you talking back to them? I know I need help with that for my kids. Okay. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. O'Toole put a peanut butter sandwich and a nice cool glass of milk on the kitchen table for her little girl when she came home from school. Pretty soon, the front door slammed, and in bounced Mary, her red braids switching like little ponies. Yeah, switching like little ponytails. Her mother said, "How was school, darling?" Mary said as she gulped her milk and took a big bite of the sandwich, "Well, this afternoon, Miss Crabtree said Mary O'Toole will stay in at recess and put the paint boxes away. And I said," Mary took another gulp of the milk, "You're the teacher here, Miss Crabtree. Why don't you put away all the paint boxes and let me go out and play?" Everybody in the whole room laughed but mean old Miss Crabtree, and she sent me into the cloak room. Mary took another large bite and looked up at her mother expectantly to see if she would appreciate how smart she was. However, her mother said, "That was a very rude thing for you to do, Mary, and I'm ashamed of you. When you finish your sandwich and milk, you had better go up to your room and stay until dinner. You can concentrate on how rude you were to nice Miss Crabtree." Mary pulled her mouth down at the corners, squinted up her pretty brown eyes, and said, "Why should I?" She kept her mouth pulled down and blinked her eyes rapidly in a most disagreeable way. Mrs. O'Toole was dumbfounded. Never had her little Mary acted this way before. She said quietly, "You should because I tell you to. Now scat." Mary walked slowly out of the kitchen, switching her skirt and her braids and managing to look impudent, even from the back. When she reached the top of the stairs, she called down to her mother, "I'm going because I want to, but not because you tell me to," and dashed into her room and banged the door. That night at dinner, Mary was quite normal, but after dinner, her daddy said, "Scoot the dishes off the table, Wean. Your mammy's tired." And his dear little Wean, instead of jumping up and doing what she was told, pulled her mouth down until she looked like a sad jack-o'-lantern, squinted up her eyes, and said, "I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Anyways, you eat here. Why don't you clear the table?" She blinked her eyes rapidly. Her father looked as though he might be going to give her a spanking, but then he noticed that it was time for the news, so instead he went into his study and turned on the radio and lit his pipe. Mary did clear off the table, and she dried the dishes, but she kept blinking her eyes and muttering. The next morning her mother said, "Please hurry with your breakfast, Mary. The children are waiting, and you'll make them late for school." Mary pulled her mouth down and began blinking. She said, "I'm the one that's eating this breakfast, madam." She pronounced it matam. Mary's mother sighed and said, "If you only knew how unattractive you look when you talk like that, you would stop right now." Mary mumbled something into her mouth. Then she grabbed her sweater and slammed out the front door. Mrs. O'Toole went to the telephone and called her friend Mrs. Ragbag. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Ragbag. Have you noticed any change in Calliope lately?" Mrs. Ragbag said, "Well, no, I can't say I have, Mrs. O'Toole. She seems to be studying hard in school. And she eats and sleeps well. Have you noticed anything wrong with her?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "No, it's not Calliope I'm worried about. It's Mary. Yesterday afternoon she came home from school and seemed perfectly normal, and she looked all right, but she told me how very impudent she had been in her school. I punished her, of course. In fact, I sent her to her room to stay until dinner, but she was impudent to me. She was rude to her father, too. I just cannot understand it. I thought perhaps all the children were acting this way. She pulls down her mouth and squints her eyes and blinks. She looks hideous." Mrs. Ragbag said, Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Toole, because Mary's always been such a dear little girl. I don't know what to suggest. Why don't you call Mrs. Keystop? You know what a problem her little Chucky is. She should have some ideas. Mrs. O'Toole said, Thank you very much, Mrs. Ragbag. I'll call Mrs. Keystop right now. So she called Mrs. Keystop, but she wasn't at home, and the maid, Nora, answered the phone. Nora said, Sure, and Mrs. Keystop isn't home, Mrs. O'Toole. But how is it that dear little Mary, the one with the beautiful braids? Oh, but how is that dear little Mary, the one with the beautiful braids? Mrs. O'Toole said, Oh, Nora, that's just why I called. Mary has suddenly become so disrespectful. She answers back, and she pulls her mouth down and squints up her eyes, and she blinks. She started yesterday, and I'm so upset. I called to ask Mrs. Keystop if she's ever had similar trouble with Chucky. Nora said, Sure, and there's not any trouble she hadn't had with Chucky. He's so rude he talks back to himself, but I'm thinking you better call Mrs. Piggle. That little woman has forgotten more about children than I'll ever know. She even taught Hubert Prentice to pick up his toys. Now, there's a spoiled child. Mrs. O'Toole said, Oh, thank you so much, Nora. I should have thought of Mrs. Pigglewiggle in the first place. I'll call her right now. Mrs. O'Toole called Mrs. Pigglewiggle and said, Oh, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I'm so worried about my little girl, Mary. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, I know Mary. She has such beautiful red hair and such lovely brown eyes. Mrs. O'Toole said, Well, she still has the hair anyways, but her eyes don't look pretty anymore. She squints them up and pulls down her mouth and blinks. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, Well, she answers back and is impudent, isn't she? Mrs. O'Toole said, Yes, she is, but how did you know? I do hope she hasn't been rude to you. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, Oh, no, Mary is very polite to me, but I can recognize the answer backer symptoms. When was she first like this? Yesterday afternoon, right after school. She was rude to dear Mrs. Crabtree, her teacher, and when I sent her to her room, she made this hideous face and said, I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Mrs. Pigglewiggle, she walks in such a way that her braids twitch, and even her back looks rude. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, Don't worry so, Mrs. O'Toole. Some of the most charming children I know were once answer-backers. Fortunately, Mary has only just begun, so she can be cured in no time at all. You drop by here after lunch, and I will give you Penelope Parrot to keep for a while. Mrs. Garrison has been using Penelope, but she has had her for a month now, and Gary should be cured by this time. So don't worry, Mrs. O'Toole. Penelope is a cure for even the most stubborn cases of answer-backishness. Mrs. O'Toole hung up the phone, and she felt much better. Right after lunch, she went down to Mrs. Pigglewiggle's house and got Penelope. Penelope Parrot was a large, cross-looking green bird who blinked rapidly. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, as she handed the cage to Mrs. O'Toole, Fortunately for you, Penelope will only talk to children. During the walk home from Mrs. Pigglewiggle's house, Penelope was quiet in a very cross, blinky-eyed sort of way, and when Mrs. O'Toole hung her cage in the kitchen, she hunched down and put her head under her wing. But when Mary came in from school, Penelope woke up and began preening her feathers. Mary was delighted with Penelope. She said, Oh, Mother, I've always wanted a parrot. Do you think she can talk? Mrs. O'Toole said, She hasn't said a word since I brought her home, but I was told that she speaks only to children. Mary said, Where did you get her, Mother? Is she for me? May I have her in my room for my very, very own? Her mother said, I'm keeping her for a friend of mine, but when you play in your room, you may hang her cage by the window. Mary brought her milk and cookies over by Penelope's cage and was very surprised when Penelope blinked and said rudely, Give me a bite, pig! Mary broke off a piece of the cookie and poked it through the bars of the cage. Penelope snatched it and said, Thanks, pig! Mary turned to her mother. Well, she's certainly not very polite, is she? Her mother said, Perhaps she's been around rude people. After all, she's only a parrot and repeats what she hears. Penelope blinked her eyes and said, Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Mrs. O'Toole looked a little shocked, but Mary laughed and said, May I bring the children in to see her, Mother? May I? Before Mrs. O'Toole could answer, Penelope began hopping up and down, blinking and yelling, Say, are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here? Mary's mother said, I am the boss around here, Penelope, and if you are not more courteous, I'll put a cloth over your cage. Penelope blinked and muttered. Mary bounced up and down excitedly. What will that do, Mother? What will that do to Penelope? Mrs. O'Toole said, If I put a cloth over her cage, she will think that it's nighttime and go to sleep. Penelope squawked, I'll do it because I want to, but not because you tell me to. Mary was certainly surprised at that because she thought that she had made up that brilliant remark. She didn't dare to look at her mother, so she put on her sweater and went out to find her playmates. Pretty soon she came back with 5 little friends, and they spent the afternoon standing around Penelope's cage and laughing at her rude remarks. This worried Mrs. O'Toole. If Mary thought Penelope was so amusing, then perhaps she would imitate her and become ruder than ever. So she called Mrs. Piggle. She said in a low voice so the children in the kitchen could not hear, Mrs. Piggle, I'm rather worried because although Penelope is very rude to the children, they don't mind at all. Mary thinks she's very funny and laughs at everything she says. Mrs. Piggle said, Just remember, Mrs. O'Toole, that this is only the first day with Penelope. Let Mary be with her as much as she wishes. Keep Penelope's cage in the breakfast nook when Mary eats her lunch and breakfast, and in the dining room at night. Hang her cage in Mary's bedroom when she goes up there to play, and have Penelope sleep in Mary's room. I am sure that you do not have to worry. Penelope has never failed me. Mrs. O'Toole said, All right, Mrs. Piggle, I'll do just as you say. Goodbye. Just before dinner, Mrs. O'Toole said to Mary, Mary, dear, send your little friends home now. It's time for you to set the table. Mary turned to her mother and began pulling down her mouth, squinting her eyes and blinking. But before she could say a word, Penelope yelled out, Say, who's the boss around here? Who's the boss around here? Who's the boss anyway? Mary's mother quickly put a cloth over her cage, politely asked the children to leave, and sent Mary to set the table. When Mr. O'Toole came home from the office, she took the cover off again to show him the parrot, and then she hung Penelope in the dining room window. After dinner, Mary's daddy said, Up on your toes, Miss Molly O'Toole, and scoot the dishes out to the kitchen. Mary put down her mouth, squinted up her eyes, and blinked. But Penelope said, What am I, a servant? Work, work, work. What am I, a servant? Say, who's the boss around here? Mary's daddy laughed so hard the tears ran down his cheeks. But Mary stuck out her tongue at Penelope, who bounced around yelling, Only snakes stick out their tongues! Only snakes stick out their tongues! Here's a picture. Mary pulled her tongue in quickly and shut her lips together tight. My, but she thought Penelope was horrid. Mrs. O'Toole hung Penelope's cage in Mary's room, and Penelope squawked and made so much noise that Mary finally said, Oh, be quiet! And Penelope blinked and said, I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Mary flounced into bed and turned off the light. The next morning, Mary was very slow. She could not find one of her socks, and she couldn't button her dress, and finally her mother called, Mary, hurry, dear, breakfast is waiting. Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and said, Oh, hurry yourself. Penelope had been preening her tail feathers, but when she heard Mary, she jerked her head up and said, Oh, hurry yourself, slow poke. Hurry yourself, slow poke. Hurry, slow poke, hurry, slow poke, hurry, slow poke, hurry. Mary said crossly, Oh, be quiet, Penelope. Penelope said, I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Say, who's the boss around here? Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Mary ran downstairs and sat down to breakfast, leaving Penelope still shouting. But Mrs. O'Toole ran upstairs and got Penelope and hung her cage by the kitchen window. When the children called for Mary, and Mrs. O'Toole said, Hurry, dear, you will make your friends late for school. Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and blinked. But before she could say a word, Penelope squawked, I'm the one who's eating this breakfast, madam. Hurry, that's all I hear. Hurry yourself, slow poke. Mary was ashamed to look at her mother, so she rushed off without kissing her goodbye. Penelope yelled after her. Hurry, slowpoke! Bells ringing! Bells ringing! When Mary came home from school that afternoon, she kissed her mother and said, Mother, I apologized to Mrs. Crabtree today, and she said that next week I may be monitor for the scissors. Penelope yelled, Who said so? Who said so? Who said so? Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Mary turned to Penelope and said, You are a very rude bird. If you don't hush right now, I will put the cloth over your cage. Penelope blinked and said, Hush, 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 that's all I hear. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Who's the boss around here anyways? Mary's mother said, I am the boss around here, and I think it's time you went home, Penelope. Mary, would you like to return Penelope to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? Mary said, Oh, yes, Mother, and may I stay and play? Mrs. O'Toole said, I think you better come home and practice. Your music lesson is tomorrow, you know. Mary started to draw down her mouth, squint up her eyes, and blink. But suddenly she looked at Penelope, and so she turned up her mouth, opened her eyes, and smiled. And she said, All right, Mother, I'll come home right after I return that rude Penelope. The end. We'll see you guys tomorrow for Chapter 4.